I'm Dr. Roy Peter Clark. I'm the senior scholar here at the Poynter Institute, which is the school for journalism that owns the Tampa Bay Times publishing company. I was hired by Gene Patterson almost exactly 40 years ago to work on a special project. Gene at the time was one of the most respected newspaper editors in America. He was president of the American Society of Newspaper Editors. And he had a reputation of being one of America's best writers as a journalist and as an editor. And he wanted to improve the quality of newspaper writing generally. And he came up with a couple of different plans. One was that ASNE would establish what's now called the Distinguished Writing Awards. And the other is that he would bring somebody into his newsroom, the St. Petersburg Times, to try to improve the quality of the writing in American journalism. He figured if he could figure out a way in his newsroom to do that, then he could help other news organizations, other newspapers do that. So for the last 40 years, I've been working on writing improvement projects across America and around the world. There came a time when I remember asking Gene questions that I was curious about his personal history and his work. I said, Gene, we had a lunch one day, I said, Gene, you know, I've heard about all of these remarkable columns that you wrote back in Atlanta from 1960 to 1968 when you were editor there. I said, but I've only seen a couple. I've seen a couple of the most famous ones. But I would love to read them. Is there any way I can get my hands on those? And he was very dismissive. He said, oh, you don't want to hear this deep, strong voices. You don't want to read those old things. And I said, yeah. I said, I'm so curious about them. He said, okay, come back to the house. So we got in the car and we drove back to the house. Right along the water. And we went in and he opened up a closet door. And he pulled out these big albums. And there were 8 of them. And I realized that each of the albums represented 1 year in his tenure as editor of the Atlanta Constitution. So they were marked 1960, 61, 62, 63, 64, 65, 66, 67, 68, so 9 albums, because he left the Constitution in 68 to go to the Washington Post. Then, as I looked inside one of them, I realized that somebody, my guess was it wasn't him, had taken a scissor and clipped out his column for the day. And had taken old-fashioned glue, I think it was called mucilage, and had glued in the column. Each column was about 800 words, and had glued it into the album in chronological order. And you can see these were old because the glue was kind of seeping through the surface of the paper. And I soon realized that he had written or published a column with his name on it every single day from his arrival in 1960 to his departure in 1968. a signed column, 800 words. I learned later that he didn't do what I would have done, which is write maybe 2 columns on Thursday, 2 on Friday, so you have the weekend off. He got up every single day, he shaved, like a clean-cut man should, like an army guy should. He had his breakfast, and he wrote his column. And there, in this treasure trove, these 9 albums, were more than 3,200 columns. As I would learn later, because I read every single one of them, that many of them were about what we now think of as the classic period of the civil rights movement. From 1960 through the amazing events of 1963, Dr. King's, the March on Washington, Dr. King's famous speech, the terrible bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in September of 1963, for which he wrote probably his most famous column, all of the protests, all of the social changes, the events at the University of Georgia, the attempts to desegregate the schools, all the deaths, all the violence. And he had committed himself, as had his mentor, Ralph McGill, whom he called either Mr. McGill or Pappy, depending on the circumstances, that they were white Southerners who understood the Southern problem, the Southern agony, and who understood profoundly that the South had to change. And it could change if it was inspired by its better angels. And that if it did change, the sky would not fall. And in fact, the South would be a better place, a place that was more fully integrated into the American fabric. So I grabbed those 9 albums, I put them in the trunk of my car. I drove them about 2.5 miles from Gene's house back to the Poynter Institute. I parked out front. I ran inside, and I called David Shedden, who at that time was Poynter's historian, librarian, and archivist. Someone who had followed Gene's work very carefully. And I told him I had something I wanted to show him. And he came out to the parking lot, and I opened the trunk of the car. And there's a scene in, where is it, in the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark, where Indiana Jones sort of has somehow gotten his hands on the Ark of the Covenant. And one of the Nazis, the villains in the movie, throw open the top of the Ark, and suddenly there's this incredible moment where this fantastic energy just kind of rushes all over. So it melts his face, as it turns out, you know. And David looks at the trunk of the car. In the trunk, he sees what's there. I tell him what's there. And without my asking, without my permission or even knowing exactly what was going to happen, he rushes, he grabs them and he gathers them and he brings them back into the safety and security of the Institute. And I don't see them again for months. And then suddenly he comes, knocks on my door, my office, and he hands me these 9 albums, not the originals, which he has now preserved and protected, but these copies of every single one, which are turned over to me for my research. I brought them home. I stacked them in my little den, and over a period of weeks and weeks, I sat and essentially became immersed in this sort of virtual reality in the work of a great journalist and writer who is telling me the story of what it was like to be in Atlanta from 1960 to 1968. And it was my education in both the darkest elements of American history leading to some of the most inspiring and triumphant. With the help of one of America's great Southern historians, Ray Arsenault, whose office happens to be across the street from Poynter at the University of South Florida in St. Petersburg, we selected out of those 3,000 columns, we selected about 200, and over a period of time, cut that number down to 125, organized them in chronological order, wrote sort of framing documents, sort of background information, some introductions, some historical introductions, a sort of a journalistic view of what was happening during those years. Added some photography from the period. And the University Press of Florida published that. I believe it was in 2002, under the title, The Changing South of Gene Patterson, Journalism and Civil Rights, 1960 to 1968. And those of us who knew Gene, especially in Florida, not as the civil rights columnist, but as this sort of distinguished newspaper editor of the St. Petersburg Times, there was a kind of what happened next was sort of a great revival, where many people got to reimagine Gene in terms of this great role he played during the 1960s. So Gene won his Pulitzer in 1967 for work that he had written in 1966. So if we think of this in 2016 as the Pulitzer centennial year, we realize that Gene's Pulitzer comes exactly at the half centennial. So on the 50th anniversary of the Pulitzer Prizes, Gene will win his Pulitzer. And he won them for a series of editorials in which he critiqued the Georgia state legislature for its unwillingness to seat a young African American politician, a civil rights activist named Julian Bond, who had been duly elected to as a member of the Georgia State Legislature. The Georgia State Legislature. Bond became a controversial figure. In this case, not just because he was African American, but because he was an opponent of the Vietnam War. And he was one of the first leaders. Dr. King, of course, would become another, whom the struggle for civil rights became conflated in certain ways with the anti-war movement. And this angered the most conservative members of the legislature. They refused to seat him. And Gene, who was who fought in General Patton's army in World War II, and and had aspirations in his own mind to become a military general. He had affinity with the military, and was slow in coming around to the notion that there were serious problems in the ways in which the Vietnam War was being waged and managed. So he had no affection for the idea that these two movements, the civil rights movement, which he embraced fully and progressively, and the anti-war movement, that these things should be somehow thought of in the same light. And there's an exchange of letters between Mr. Patterson and Dr. King, in which they very politely describe their differences on the issue of the Vietnam War, and with a promise to sort of get together and talk these things out. Dr. King would be tragically would be assassinated before those things could happen. When I read those editorials that Gene wrote that won him his Pulitzer Prize, I think any fair critic would recognize that they're probably not his most eloquent editorials. They would not stand as his best written work. But they were part of this body of work that he was creating during the 1960s, for which he would be honored. Sometimes there's something in the Academy Awards, it's sort of called a Lifetime Achievement Award. And there are people who think that sometimes happens with the Pulitzers, that a person receives a prize maybe for work that was not the best work of this particular journalist, columnist, or writer, but is rewarded at a point in a journalist's career when their reputation is very high, and when the Pulitzer board might be looking for an opportunity to honor somebody. These are not anywhere in the written rules of the Pulitzer Prizes, but just happens to be one of the effects. Now, I have to say that between about 19 1956 and about 1972, there are a dozen white Southern editorial writers who win Pulitzer Prizes for editorial writing. That's a remarkable sort of regional achievement, perhaps unprecedented, and not duplicated in the history of the Pulitzer Prizes. A couple of these went to editors at big newspapers. Ralph McGill and Gene Patterson in Atlanta, but many went to editorialists in tiny newspapers. Hazel Brannon Smith, the only woman in the group, out of Lexington, Mississippi, writing against the Klan, fighting against the odds, fending off economic boycotts and physical threats, eventually having to move out of Mississippi in the face of the work of the Klan and the white citizen councils. These people had these astonishing qualities. They had moral courage, first of all, to say and do what was right. They had physical courage in the face of all kinds of intimidation. And they had, Gene was the best writer of the bunch, I would argue, but they all had this capacity to marshal the English language to the act of persuasion and using words to fend off violence. That the pen was not just mightier than the sword, it was mightier than the flaming cross. This is a remarkable collective achievement. When you talk to Gene, especially with words of praise, he would gently push back and say that, no, they were not the courageous ones. The courageous ones were the young African American men and women who put their lives on the line, marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, facing the police dogs in Birmingham, Alabama, facing the cattle prods, the sheriffs, mounted sheriffs in Selma. He would mention great men like Congressman John Lewis, who in my mind is America's Nelson Mandela. I heard him say recently, that I was beaten, I was bloodied, I was knocked unconscious and left for dead so that you could vote. And he did. And what we're talking about now is not ancient history. Gene wrote his editorials 50 years ago, the year I graduated from high school, at a time when the South was still suffering under America's equivalent of apartheid, legal separation of the races, enforced by violence. Much of that violence perpetrated by people who had legal authority to impose it. And that's a stain on the soul of America that we're still trying to find a way to erase. But those protesters and those editorial writers took us a long way, and we're forever in their debt.